Hedberg talk session will delve into discussion on art, the history of future possibilities and hope as a muscle, with UTAS Pro Vice-Chancellor Aboriginal Leadership, Greg Lehman, co-curator and UTAS Director, Curatorial and Cultural Collections, Caine Chennatt, and joining us on screen will be exhibiting artist Jenna Lee. Please join me in welcoming Greg, Caine and Jenna to the stage.
Thank you, Amelia. Hi, Jenna. Hi, Greg. Long time no see. Hello. So I acknowledge that we are physically present here in Hobart, moving in a country, and we're broadcasting out of this country as well, the land of the Palawa people. For many of whom, up until even to this day, this notion of the future and the past are less divided in a temporal sense. And so perhaps, Greg, we might start the conversation if you could bring us all on the same page with our audience to the answer of what is the Everywhen, and how might this differ, and typically from how we consider time today.
Thanks, Caine. Look, I suspect that really everybody here knows what the Everywhen is already. We're encouraged to think that we don't, because particularly in Western academic traditions, in Christian traditions, we are force-fitted into a linear narrative of time. And it has its functions. It gives institutions like the Christian Church, for example, an ability to exercise power by leveraging people's fear of death and proposing that there's an afterlife that, you know, adherence to doctrine and dogma will provide the keys to. So it's very functional. It's a mythology that pretty well the whole of Western culture and even capitalism itself, you know, the urge to be a consumer, which feeds capitalist development, is also based on this feeling of embeddedness in linear time. So that's the construct that we live in. But I hope I'm right in saying that I think that everybody here is, you know, deep down inside is uncomfortable with that, senses that there's something that doesn't quite make sense with that. We all have ideas and aspirations and feelings and nostalgias, which kind of transcend that. They fold back and forth. The title of this session, Future Nostalgia, is an interesting example of that. It's a juxtaposition of some ideas which suggest that maybe we're longing for something in the future that we know from the past, and that's exactly what draws us into the future, is familiarity with our own existential world. So I would argue that even though the term Everywhen is one of the European Australian expressions which has been coined to try and understand this concept, which is also often referred to as dreamtime. It's not exclusively an Australian Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander idea. It is an Indigenous idea, but I would hasten to remind everybody that unless you know that your ancestors got off a spaceship somewhere, everyone here is from somewhere. We're all distanced to varying degrees in space and time from our ancestral homelands, from our ancestral ceremonies and languages and traditions. And of course, the further we are away, the the more complex and multiple those traditions that we come from are. I mentioned at the opening of the exhibition that a really good example for if any of you really want to get your head into this idea, see the film 10 Canoes, Rolf de Heer and Peter Jigger. It's a great cinematic exploration of exactly how the past and the present and the future coexist and interact. It's a circular idea of time. The West is actually the odd culture out in this, because if you look at most of the other older religious traditions, they all have a certain degree of circularity or folding in. And I'd suggest that old traditional Western Christian linear narrative is also starting to fall apart. There seems to be an obsession in Hollywood at the moment with multiverse cinema. I mean, this is another expression of coexistence of time, and anyone who likes to read contemporary physics and cosmology will be aware that this is also the state of scientific thinking at the moment. So that in itself, is an indication that knowledge systems are starting to fold back into these ancient traditions. So there you go. That's my effort at describing what the Everywhen is.
Thank you, Greg. I was, as you were speaking, my mind just immediately went to, there is a current obsession with, time travel in Hollywood and multi-universes and collapsing time. But in each of those scenarios, there is still this kind of linear kind of software underneath that says that the past is very much in the past. But we know from so many individuals who have shared this in multiple contexts, the past is never truly in the past and it's here alive. And so I'm curious, maybe Jenna, if you can still hear us. Yes, great. I'm curious about how you have sought to work with the archive, because a lot of your practice involves the archive, and specifically about how does the past persist in your practice?
Hello, everybody. You can hear me well enough? Great. So my practice, I think, all began with the archive, and in specific, the museum archive. I'm descendant of Larrakia, Karijari and Waterman, and so to feel closer to ancestors while, importantly, I think, living off country, archives became that almost portal to what I was seeking. So I began working with archives when I lived in Brisbane, which is obviously Larrakia, or traditional owners of Darwin, so quite far away. I'm now based in Melbourne. But the work in the exhibition actually specifically used a living archive, which is Kew Gardens in London. And I collected samples from a couple of very, very large, thriving Australian gums in the dead of the London winter. The leaves had fallen. I didn't go in just ripping off the trees, importantly, but had this moment of, I was living there for 18 months, I should say, and struggling with being so far away, but kind of saw the living archive that had been taken there to be a part of a collection, and they were thriving, and not only thriving in the dead of winter in England, but they were flowering. And I just found that hugely meaningful and inspirational, that so far away from home, there were these Australian, I called the work invasive native because they weren't native to London, but of course to me, they were Australian native. And thinking about how in my work, I feel like the archive was a way to feel closer to place. But also there's this feeling closer in time, I think, to be able to handle objects or collections that were made by my ancestors or collected for the purpose of documenting the use of botanical collections. Ethnobotany collections were also hugely inspirational in that those seeds or flowers or bark or leaves were collected because they had a human use. and that where I think the archive has, and continues to inspire me. I think every time I think I'm moving away from it, you find a new object or a new something in some museum somewhere, and it just kind of pulls you back in. And I don't think, and I think a lot of First Nations artists work in this way, using the archive, I think, to feel closer in time, and space.
Thanks, Jenna. You mentioned place, and I think we're going to park that for now, even though we can't separate from place ever. But I want to go to the comment that you made about getting closer in time as well. So bringing the past into the present. Given that this is around time, perhaps let's do a bit of speculation, and I'll go back to Greg and ask, if you were to be speculative about the future with a little bit of positivity and a little bit of optimism, and look into the future of Australia, what do you see?
What do I want to see? There's a couple of things that come to mind, Caine. One of the things that I talk about is what I call the colonial firewall, and it's this thing that keeps Australia separate from its past. And there are a couple of layers to this firewall. One is the colonial firewall that separates Australian history from Aboriginal history. So they're different things. They're not continuous. They're not joined. They're somehow separate. And on the other side of that firewall is a lot of discomfort, a lot of accountability. And so, those of us who are old enough to remember, John Howard was fond of phrases like, least said, soonest mended, and let sleeping dogs lie, and branded any historians who wanted to question that firewall as black armband historians. So there's a fear of what's on the other side, because we're talking about, and here in Tasmania, we're talking about genocide. Raphael Lemkin, who coined the phrase genocide after the Second World War in lobbying for an international law to try and prevent what had happened in the form of the Holocaust from happening again, used Van Diemen's Land as an exemplar of what genocide looked like and how it worked. For most people, a genocide is something that happens somewhere else. It doesn't happen in Tasmania. It doesn't happen in Australia. It happens in Nazi Germany or maybe Rwanda. Then the second layer of that firewall is the one that separates history from prehistory. Somehow or another, there's a disconnect between the two, imagined for particular purposes. And I think that's got a lot to do with constructs of, Western ideas of time and of geography and knowledge and philosophy and all of those things. So to go to your question, what I would like to see and what I think I will, well, I don't know how much I'll see. I've got maybe 20 or 30 years left of observation, at least that I know of. But I think we'll see a progressive breaking down or questioning or problematizing of these sort of things. The stuff that I've been talking about just now, it's not stuff that has come out of my head. These are perspectives that I've gathered over the last, 40 years or so that I've been thinking about this stuff, that coheres, that precipitates a sense of the future for me. So I'm all for seeing those firewalls disappear, and for me that's about Australia kind of growing up, really, to be honest. I mentioned last night, so as well as Trollope Palawa ancestry, from Te Purukuna country in the northeast of Tasmania. I also have English and French and German ancestry. And I'm intensely interested in all of those things. I'm consumed by my Tasmanian Aboriginality, probably because I still live here. Arguably Germany is the social, economic and political powerhouse of Europe these days. Can anybody imagine Germany occupying that position if it had turned or tried to turn its back on its past, as Australia has done and arguably in many quarters still tries to do? Of course not. So there's a maturity and a strength. There's a powerful and honest relationship with the past, which involves truth-telling, and it involves breaking down those convenient ways of insulating yourself from accountability and from the things that you don't like. I mean, 3 and 4-year-old kids do this. They discover that you can tell lies in order to protect yourself from responsibility. And Australia, particularly through the 50s, 60s, into the 80s and 90s, was still that little toddler who had learned that lying was a cheap way out. So that's the future that I think I know we'll see. And maybe we'll get on to talking about cultural and historical identities a bit later on, and I'll say something more about that.
Thank you, Greg. Jenna, what would you like to see in the future?
It's such a huge question, and I think being no longer the youngest kind of adult generation, it starts to become really interesting to see how I'm millennial, and so my younger siblings are Gen Z, and so to see how far we've come in that 10-year age gap between myself and, to be from the same family, you kind of start to feel like you can think a little bit bigger than, the distance we've traveled. In those 10 years seems like we've done so much, but I think, the idea of the future I'd like to think is a very optimistic one. Obviously, there's lots of, we're so much more aware of what is going on locally and globally because of the internet. But I feel like what we've done with that in the 20 years that we've had it has kind of been really, we've done a lot. And so I'd like to think that the future is better. And I'm thinking that, where I'm seeing artists working now is that we're doing a lot of identity work. And I think that that's, bouncing off what Greg was saying, that we're gearing up to have a conversation about what the identity of Australia is. Because artists, I certainly know all of my peers, we're all making identity works. And that's because we have to, because we haven't seen it as strongly represented in the generations before us in art. So I think I'm really hopeful that, we can come out of the next 20 years and have a really, truly, wonderfully representative identity nationally that is so fun and colourful and multifaceted as we are.
Thanks, Jenna. This certainly is, from yours and Greg's comments, painting a picture of a world that is mature in its dialogic framework, mature in its representation of the diversity. It's definitely one I'm sure many in the audience, including myself, would love to live in and live long enough to die in, perhaps as well at some point. But I think you raised, yes, fingers crossed, but I think you raised an interesting point. Some of these technologies existed, but we know that the bridge to these utopias are often where the labor is often where people get really worn down, even the most optimistic of us, right? So in your practice, now this is a leap of a segue, but I'm curious, in your practice, when you're at the early stages of making your work, do you start with these concepts or do you start with the medium? How do you go about then bringing to the fore some of these issues that we raised, or some of this utopia that you've shared?
That's a really interesting point, and something I've been reflecting on, I think, since post-COVID, and we're out in the world again and we're having to talk about our art again. And I think personally my work is primarily interested in structures and ecologies. A lot of that is to do with language, which I kind of have the belief that language can be looked on as a living entity that requires that things to live. And with that correct, nourishment and input, and it can thrive and grow and evolve. Without it goes extinct. So a lot of my work kind of blends together ecologies and language, but then with a very, very, very strong focus on materiality. I think the materials do half of the labour. I'm the other half. But primarily I work with paper, and that has come from physically working with archival sources, so books, on language, and physically essentially deconstructing them in order to kind of reconstruct them. Not kind of reconstruct, I do. And there's this kind of idea of trying to add as little into it as possible, which has a very kind of scientific fiction thinking around kind of alchemy and transformation of materials from one to another. So I think I start, and it's something I've only been reflecting on in the past couple of weeks, is that I actually start with a system. That system might be language, or it might be the museum archive, or it might be ways of material transfer in nature, so like fire or something like that. But there's kind of these systems, and then the material has to make sense with that. And then just add the layer of I'm just personally obsessed with paper. So paper always, the work into Everywhen is a digital work. It's a projection, which is kind of my other realm of creating, is working with photographs that I've taken of, and then manipulating them into something new. I think it's process driven as well.
It's interesting you mentioned the system and the structure. There's currently in the exhibition, there's a poster, quite an evocative work called "Let's Crack the System," and this is from 1988. So I want to circle back as you refer to the archive, as you refer to your peers and the work that they're making along with yourself. Let's circle back for a moment and go to this series of posters from 88, where we see some of those anxieties take shape in material, on paper, in a very analog way. However, some would argue, who have just seen the show too, that 35 years later, we're still here, right? They're still so pertinent. It could have almost just been as though they were made last night, or the day before, or tomorrow even. Greg, I'm going to ask you the big question. Why? Why are we still here?
Caine, I think it gets back to that rather uncharitable comment I made earlier on about Australia just being a bit of an impetuous toddler. We haven't grown up. We're still kind of doing the things as a nation, as an economy, as a society that were commenced out of that period of colonisation, of the importation of convicts, and that white slavery system, and the not the impact on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but because it makes it sound like some sort of passive process, like innocent bystanders get knocked over by a falling branch or something. It's, there were intentional, purposeful, industrial processes at play to remove First Nations people from their country in order to open up that country for economic development. I mean, that's why Governor Arthur in Van Diemen's Land commenced this thing that was called the Black War, where every able-bodied man in the colony was armed and equipped and stretched out in a series of cordons across those districts that had been occupied by the British. in order to drive Aboriginal people off their country. Now, the country that we're talking about was country that had been identified as agricultural. It was designed for agricultural production, for growing wheat, growing wool, to send away to Sydney and back to the heart of empire. That hasn't really changed much. Tasmania in particular has still got this kind of almost like a cargo cult mentality where our masters and the sources of everything good are somewhere else, and we have to send things away to them to appease them, so that these remote gods can favour us with some more opportunities for more of the same, more of what we've had in the past. So we make the mistake of filing our aspirations for the future in the past. That's probably a dysfunctional aspect of the Everywhen. What was your question again? Can you just remind me?
My question was, oh my God. Why?
Oh, yeah. So why are we stuck with this? Yeah. Look, we have been slowly climbing out of that hole, but we're still quite thoroughly in it. I mean, I think hopefully everybody in this slightly select group will agree that, climate change is unambiguously true, and not only that, but it is now costing people their homes, their livelihoods, their wealth, their lives. And, there are still politicians out there who expect to be elected by standing up and denying that it's true, that the scientists are confused, or that, it's just a big green conspiracy. They're indicators of why we've been stuck. And I think they are people, voices, that are still rusted onto these old trenchant habits of the past. We've got to grow up. And one thing that I really like about the past, about the future, that enables me to be optimistic is I don't know what's going to happen. Now, if I felt like I knew what was going to happen, that'd be pretty depressing, because it would mean that the generations that are coming through now, Jenna's generation and younger, would be making the same mistakes. Now, I don't get the feeling that that's going to happen, because I can't see what's coming down towards us, and that's a good thing.
You used a few words like filing away and the containers and sending off food and other aspects away in these kind of silos almost, and the denial of climate change. Yet at the same time, there is a lot of progress in those spaces. If I was to be optimistic for a moment, to pick up on your point about the next generation, perhaps we're seeing more of a breakdown in those silos, right? Between, and recognizing that there's not just this one answer, there's one solution to getting about solving these problems, right? Jen, if I take it from there and throw to you, perhaps you experience this quite on a daily basis in your practice or your practices, right? Because not only do you practice across different media, in installation and in textiles and in paper, but also across different disciplines, across art, craft, as loaded as that might be with your First Nations heritage, and design. And so I'm curious to hear from you, how do you navigate these different containers? Where do they interface with each other?
I'm actually on the board of Craft Victoria, because I have a love and a passion for craft, and specifically the history of women's contribution to Australia's economy through craft. So always happy to talk about craft, but I think something that, and I mentioned it to you this morning, Caine, when we caught up, when I started making art quote unquote seriously, so when my work started getting picked up in awards, I was given the advice to stop practicing design, or to stop talking about the fact that I practice design, which was a very old idea, that to be considered a serious artist, you had to dedicate yourself wholeheartedly to that. And I kind of just ignored that because the design work I do is fundamental to my practice. So I call it my day job because I do it in the morning because that's when clients are online. I design book covers predominantly I design book covers predominantly, and then the book covers I do design are for First Nations authors. So for me, it's this really important part of my work because a huge part of my art practice is that I deconstruct colonial books. So for me, it's this kind of two sides of one coin. One, I'm helping to ensure that First Nations authors have books on shelves from that these stories are, represented, but represented in a way that's, going to sell. I'm never going to deny the fact that I design book covers because I want my authors to do really well, because the books that I tear apart for my practice are books that I'm trying to take out of circulation because they're not written by the people that they're about and they don't have correct information. So there's this kind of two, and I was asked a question once if it got to the point where most of these books are out of circulation and I've designed covers for hundreds of First Nations authors, will my art practice cease to be important? And I certainly hope so. Also hope I've moved on by then. But yeah, design is also what I consider my trade. Designers hate when I say that, but it's a trade, it's a craft that keeps me economically sustained. And it's really important, I think, for artists. And I talk to especially students, often high school students and university students, about the fact that all artists have another job. We just don't always talk about the fact. Some of my favourite artists I know have day jobs working for local council. So I think it's really important that we start to demystify how you make it as an artist, because it can be deceiving. Yeah.
Thanks, Jenna. Greg, similarly for you, you started early on in life sciences, and now you're a commentator, you're an author, you're an artist, you're a curator, and I'm not even going to get into the work that you do for the university in stewarding Aboriginal leadership. But how do you find, in a similar way to Jenna, that cross-disciplinary approach? I'm curious, how does your early work in life sciences show up in the work you do today?
From a disciplinary point of view, I would describe myself as an art historian now, but I started off in doing a degree in zoology and botany, but it was a third major in geography that actually made the most sense, because what I've been doing throughout, since the 80s is really just trying to work out a meaningful place for myself as an Aboriginal person in the world. And, the archive back in the 60s and 70s when I was growing up didn't offer much. The education system didn't offer much about Australian, let alone Tasmanian Aboriginal people. I grew up in Ulverston, little country town up in the northwest, and it wasn't until I was, 10 or 12 and started to become aware of this thing called cultural identity, that I was able to make sense of a whole bunch of things that I'd never really thought about before, but I'd just taken for granted. The fact that, I had these great aunts and uncles who had dark skin. That's just who they were. It didn't mean anything. And I then noticed, as I started to talk about this stuff, I noticed that the world was starting to tell me things. It was starting to tell me that I should be called Boong, for example, or nigger. I had to put up with all that shit going through high school. It taught me about what being Aboriginal is supposed to be. And that was very different to what I was learning from my family. So there's a lot of, I don't like the term, but it's probably the best fit. There's a whole bunch of decolonisation needs to go on across structures and society, but there's also a decolonisation of identity that needs to occur, because Aboriginal people have listened too much to what our social surroundings have told us about what we're supposed to be, and most of that is negative. and disempowering, right up to the present day. I think we need to start listening more to, to our families, to country, language. When we were talking about language before, language is country, language is family. And, there's a lot of nourishment there. Don't know whether I answered your question at all, Ben.
This is good. I'm going to pick up on a point. But to your point there too, I'd love to hear from Jenna, because picking up from Greg, you're a Larrakia, Kurrajari, Wurundjeri woman from Northern Territory and WA. And you've moved, I understand, so many times growing up, right? So, and simultaneously you have heritages that are Japanese, Filipino.
And Chinese, yep.
And Chinese, sorry.
No, that's okay.
This complication, this sort of complexity of different plural identities, I think, how do you go about navigating that, and how does that show up in your work? I think it's really core to my work, and I do always acknowledge that it was my father's generation that fought really, really hard in every possible sense to be Aboriginal in public, if that makes sense, to be able to walk around and be safe in the body that you inhabit, was a lot of work for my father's generation, certainly my grandmother's generation, and that I'm now, my generation, we're able to kind of look at understanding that our other identities don't mean that we're not Aboriginal. And so a lot of my work, because when I walk around the world, people read me as being Eurasian or European Asian, which is true. My mother is classic Irish, Scottish settler. My dad is Aboriginal, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino. And so when people read that, it's not an incorrect reading of who I am as a person. They just don't understand that I can also be Aboriginal at the same time. And so a lot of my work, and I think where I started, where my work gained traction with the public was when other mixed First Nations people and community could actually see themselves in my work. And it was this kind of, I almost didn't realize what I'd done when I was doing it. I was just trying to make work that felt authentic to me. But in doing so, I was making work that I think if you were to close your eyes and picture Aboriginal art, a certain image comes into your mind. I don't make work that looks anything like that. So that's because that's not authentic to me. And it is absolutely authentic to the people who make it. So it kind of has become, and I'm actually looking at my studio now and there's work all over the floor, which is getting more and more strongly influenced by specifically Larrakia's proximity and history and trade relations with China and Southeast Asia. That's a part of our history up north, and it's present in my family lineage. And so to start to bring that through in the, for want of a better word, the aesthetic, is starting to become really important for me. And it's that work that the older generation did that means that I can be so confident in my Aboriginality, that it means I get to explore the tapestry of other things that a lot of us are. You raised, authenticity and I think even just more broadly, identities can be perceived and received in so many fraught ways. And Greg, you raised a little bit about this just earlier, and I've heard you speak on numerous occasions with such cultural humility about how you hold your European ancestry with your Tasmanian Aboriginal ancestry heritage as well. In a future, how do we move towards uncomplicating identity while retaining its complexity?
I think the key to moving forward in a way that is not too difficult or too confounding is just to be open to the reality of change. One of my favourite Stoic philosophers is Marcus Aurelius, and one of his probably most famous quotes is, "Life is nothing if not change, and change is nature's delight." Change is necessary and inevitable, and identities change. There was a lot of political power to be wielded coming out of the late 60s with the Black Power movement, particularly the Black Panthers and Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, but also Martin Luther King Jr., although he wasn't so separatist in his thinking. But the idea of being black was it was imbued with power, so it served a purpose. These days, I try, just as a way of kind of running a flagpole, I try and avoid using terms like non-Indigenous and non-Aboriginal. I kind of did that earlier on when I said, hey, we're all from somewhere. I think those dichotomies are getting to be well past their use-by date, and we're seeing these binaries and dichotomies that have been instruments for the maintenance of certain power structures, the patriarchy being one of the most obvious. These things are starting to crumble now, and they're being. I think they're in a state of transformation at the moment. No pun intended. And we're seeing a real what's the term? Just a real mix-up of ideas. I don't think things are really landing yet. I don't think they need to land yet. But what I really like is younger generations being confident enough, and maybe my generation can take a little bit of responsibility / credit for this empowerment, because we said to our kids, do what you want to do, be what you want to be. Yeah. And you know the song. And they're doing that. And some of it is really confronting for us ourselves. Hey, we didn't tell you to do that. Look, it's neither good nor bad. It's inevitable. It is change. It is Marcus Aurelius's change. It's nature's change in action. And while we see binary constructs of gender and sexuality and various other things starting to crumble all around us now, or at least be really profoundly questioned, I'm waiting to see that happen to this black, white, Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal, Indigenous, non-Indigenous set of constructs as well, because we've used them really deftly and obtained a great deal of progress out of that. But if that's all we do into the future, I think we'll be really constrained by working with those colonising ideas. Because, as I was saying, when I was a young teenager, I was taught things that were not functional for me. And I'm not convinced that some of the constructs of cultural identity that we cling on to at the moment are really that functional. I'd much rather this more pluralistic. There's strength in richness and in embracing diversity.
Thank you, Greg.
I'd love to know what Jenna, you think of that.
Please, Jenna. Yeah.
Oh no, I completely agree. And like I said, I have a play out in my on top of all of those identities. I'm also queer and have been in a relationship with a woman for 10 years. So, we got that talk from your parents, do whatever you want, love whoever you are. And even between myself and the younger generation of siblings I have, genderqueer and non-binary and trans siblings now. And I think that's set up so quickly. And I think you're right that I agree that I'm hoping that what we can start to do is have these kind of thoughts and ideas that also that expression of who you are is also applicable to identity and culture. That's without straight up appropriating something. You know what I mean, though. Like it. I think too. It's so weird to say this out loud, but I genuinely love Australia so much that what I would love for it to be is a wonderful, open and embracing place for everybody that comes here or is here, sorry. And I think it takes a great deal of love for the continent to want it to be the best possible for everybody. And I think we're seeing my generation and younger move towards this idea of, well, if it's an excellent place for one group of people, we're like, what we're trying to do is make it an excellent place for all groups of people. And that's where I get really excited that we might be able to celebrate some wins in that space and making this beautiful continent really the best for everybody. Because it's kind of not, it's excellent and wonderful, but not necessarily for everybody. So that's where we're kind of clawing our way towards.
Sounds like it sounds like on those two comments, a pluralistic and inclusive Australia for all might be the radical optimism that you're both bringing into this conversation and a hope for the future. Our revolving doors have robbed us of a little bit more time, so unfortunately we won't be able to take questions. However, I invite all of you to reach out to Greg Lehman and Jenna Lee, both who are very discoverable online and in real space as well. Please check out Jenna Lee's artwork that's currently in the exhibition at the Plimsoll Gallery. And Greg, I understand you also have a lecture coming up at IATSIS next week. Yes, urge you to look it up online. Please join me in thanking Greg Lehman and Jenna Lee.